The year was 1848, and whispers of gold, freedom, and endless opportunity rolled like thunder across the crowded streets of the East. Families, farmers, and fortune-seekers alike packed wagons with meager belongings, their eyes fixed westward. The frontier wasn't just a place on a map, it was an untamed promise of new beginnings, where courage would be tested against wilderness and lawlessness. Among the eager faces stood Elijah Carter, a rugged farmer with a restless spirit, and his wife Mary, a woman whose quiet strength masked a steel resolve. Their wagon joined a caravan of pioneers bound for lands unknown. As they crossed the muddy Mississippi, Elijah looked back one last time at the life he was leaving behind. Ahead lay deserts, mountains, and dangers unseen, but also the hope of a destiny written beneath the western sun. That night, as wolves howled in the distance and the prairie stretched endlessly under the stars, a rider approached their camp at full gallop. His coat was torn, his face streaked with blood. He dismounted and staggered forward, gasping, "The frontier! It's not what you think!" The wagon train rolled westward, creaking across the plains where the wind carried the scent of sagebrush and dust. Days blurred into nights as settlers braved river crossings, sudden storms, and wagon wheels sinking into mud. Mary clutched her children close when prairie fires crackled dangerously near. Yet with every mile, Elijah's resolve only deepened. The frontier was theirs for the taking, no matter the cost. But whispers began to spread among the travelers. Stories of outlaw gangs prowling the trails, ambushing the unsuspecting, circulated like wildfire. One night, under a pale moon, a shadow moved along the ridge above camp. A flicker of steel glinted in the moonlight, the unmistakable outline of a rifle barrel trained on the wagons below. Elijah's hand found the worn grip of his revolver as silence fell over the camp. Gunfire shattered the night. Bandits descended on the wagon train like wolves, their faces hidden beneath scarves, their pistols blazing. Screams pierced the chaos as settlers scattered, desperately trying to protect their families. Elijah stood his ground, firing into the darkness as Mary dragged their children beneath the wagon for cover. The smell of black powder and burning canvas filled the air. By dawn, the raiders had vanished, leaving behind a trail of smoke, blood, and shattered hope. The caravan had survived, but at a cost: 2 wagons lost, 3 settlers dead, and trust shaken. Elijah buried the fallen with trembling hands, swearing vengeance against the faceless marauders who stalked them. And yet, as the sun rose red over the horizon, a single boot print, fresh and deliberate, was found near Elijah's wagon. Someone was watching them. Someone who wanted more than just supplies. Weeks later, battered but unbroken, the wagon train rolled into the settlement of Dusty Creek. The town clung to the edge of the frontier like a stubborn weed, its main street lined with rough-hewn saloons, a blacksmith's forge, and a sheriff's office with peeling paint. Miners, gamblers, and cowhands filled the saloon, their laughter as sharp as broken glass. Elijah stepped through the swinging doors, his eyes adjusting to the smoke and dim lamplight. At the far table sat a man dressed in black, his hat low, his cards spread neatly before him. When Elijah approached the bar, the man in black lifted his gaze, his eyes cold and calculating. A slow grin spread across his face, as though he knew something Elijah did not. Mary tugged at Elijah's arm. "Don't," she whispered. "Not here." But it was too late. The man in black tipped his hat and said, "Welcome to Dusty Creek, stranger. I hear you've made enemies." Sheriff Tom Harlan was a weary man, his badge tarnished, his voice gruff from too many years chasing outlaws. He warned Elijah to tread carefully. Dusty Creek was a powder keg, and the wrong spark could set the town ablaze. "That man in black," Harlan muttered, "name's Silas Boone. He runs the gangs out here. Cross him, and you won't see another sunrise." But Elijah couldn't ignore the boot print found by his wagon. Nor could he forget the way Boone had smiled, as if daring him to resist. That night, as the town slept, Elijah heard the distant thunder of hooves. Riders slipped like ghosts through the darkness, circling the wagons outside Dusty Creek. When Elijah raised his rifle, Mary caught his hand. "If you fire now," she whispered, "you'll start a war." Elijah hesitated, his finger on the trigger, as the riders disappeared into the night. The dusty crossroads outside Dusty Creek became a place of whispers and warnings. By day, cattle herders drove their herds past, their shouts echoing across the plains. By night, lanterns flickered in the distance where strangers gathered, figures cloaked in shadow, plotting their next move. Elijah had begun to notice the same faces reappearing in town, men who never worked, who never smiled, who watched every newcomer like a hawk. One evening, Elijah overheard hushed voices in the stable. "The settlers won't last. Boone wants the wagons. Every last one." Another voice chuckled darkly, "And Carter, he's already marked." Rage surged through Elijah, but before he could step forward, the stable door creaked open. A pair of eyes glowed in the lamplight. The stranger grinned, revealing gold teeth, and whispered, "Eavesdropping is a dangerous habit, friend." Mary Carter was no stranger to hardship. The long days on the trail had hardened her hands and sharpened her instincts. But what Elijah didn't know was that Mary carried her own secret, a small revolver hidden beneath the folds of her dress, a weapon her father had given her before she married. She had never used it, but she kept it oiled, loaded, and ready. When Boone's men began lurking near the wagons, Mary stayed calm, watching, waiting. She knew the settlers were frightened, their resolve cracking. So, one night, she gathered them around the fire, speaking with the firelight dancing in her eyes. "We came here for freedom," she said. "If we run now, we'll spend our lives running. But if we stand together, not even Boone can break us." The settlers murmured, embers of courage rekindling. And yet, in the darkness beyond the firelight, a figure crouched, listening. When he slipped back into the shadows, the words Mary had spoken would be carried straight to Boone himself. The town awoke to silence, broken only by the creak of a saloon sign in the wind. At dawn, Elijah found a note pinned to his wagon with a bowie knife. "Meet me at the edge of town. Sunrise." He didn't need to ask who had written it. Boone's challenge was clear. As the first light painted the desert in shades of gold, Elijah stepped onto the dirt street, revolver at his side. Boone stood waiting, his black coat billowing like smoke, his hand hovering over his holster. The townsfolk gathered at windows and doorways, their breaths held in anticipation. Time slowed, the flutter of a crow's wings, the drip of sweat on Elijah's brow, the distant toll of a church bell. Then Boone smiled, a cold flash of teeth, and his hand twitched. Elijah drew, faster than he ever had in his life. 2 shots rang out, echoing across Dusty Creek. When the smoke cleared, one man lay bleeding in the dirt, but it wasn't Boone. Elijah dropped to his knees. The bullet had missed Boone and struck a bystander, a young boy who had been peeking from behind a wagon. The child's mother screamed, rushing to her son's side as Boone holstered his pistol with mocking laughter. "You see, Carter," Boone sneered. "Every time you fight me, it's the innocent who pay." The town turned on Elijah, their eyes filled with blame. Sheriff Harlan dragged him into the jailhouse, locking him behind iron bars. "I know you meant no harm," Harlan said grimly, "but Boone will twist this. He'll own this town before long." From his cell, Elijah watched Boone's men swagger down Main Street, their boots kicking up clouds of dust. The settlers who once looked to him now averted their eyes. And as night fell, Elijah realized something terrible. Boone hadn't killed him because he didn't want him dead. He wanted him broken. The night was quiet, too quiet. Sheriff Harlan sat at his desk, sipping whiskey, while Elijah stared through the bars, lost in thought. Suddenly, a crash shattered the silence. Flames licked at the jailhouse walls as smoke filled the air. Boone's men had set the place ablaze. Harlan rushed to free Elijah, but a rifle shot exploded through the window, striking the sheriff in the chest. Elijah caught him as he fell, the old lawman gasping his final words, "Stop, Boone, or all of this was for nothing." With the fire closing in, Elijah grabbed the keys, his lungs burning as he forced the cell door open. He stumbled into the street, coughing, the jailhouse collapsing in a roar of fire behind him. Boone's men watched from the shadows, their laughter echoing in the smoke. Elijah stood in the middle of the street, fists clenched, a vow burning in his heart. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of war. Dusty Creek gathered in silence as the church bell tolled, mourning Sheriff Harlan. His coffin was lowered into the dry, cracked earth, the preacher's voice trembling as he spoke of duty and sacrifice. The townsfolk bowed their heads, but their eyes flickered toward Elijah with suspicion. Whispers coiled through the crowd. Trouble followed him. Boone would never stop until Carter was gone. Mary stood firm, her hand clasped around Elijah's, her chin lifted in defiance. "They can doubt you," she whispered, "but I never will." Elijah's heart ached with guilt, knowing Boone's power was growing while the town's faith in him withered. As the last shovelful of dirt covered Harlan's grave, a rider thundered into town. His horse foamed at the mouth, his face pale with fear. "Boone's men," he gasped. "They've taken the settlers' cattle. Every last head." A hush fell over the mourners. Without cattle, the settlers would starve. Elijah's fists clenched. Boone's war had begun in earnest. Elijah rallied the settlers, determined to recover what was stolen. They rode hard into the prairie, the wind whipping at their faces, dust clouds rising in the distance where Boone's gang drove the stolen herd. The settlers spurred their tired horses forward, the thunder of hooves like drums of war. Gunfire erupted as the two groups clashed among the stampeding cattle. Settlers shouted, trying to steer the beasts while bullets tore through the air. Elijah fought like a man possessed, his revolver barking flame, but Boone's men were ruthless. One after another, settlers fell, trampled by hooves or struck by lead. As the dust cleared, Elijah realized with horror that the herd was gone, driven deeper into the desert. Their supplies were dwindling, their hope bleeding away. Mary rode to his side, her face pale but her eyes fierce. "We can't win like this," she said. Elijah knew she was right. Boone wasn't just stealing cattle. He was starving them out. That night, as despair hung heavy over the settlers' camp, a figure rode in from the darkness. He wore a tattered Confederate coat, his face half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. His horse was scarred, his eyes cold. "My name's Colton Hayes," he said in a gravelly drawl. "I know Boone. Rode with him once. And I know how to bring him down." The settlers eyed him with suspicion, but Elijah felt the weight of Hayes' words. Could they trust a man who had once ridden with Boone's gang? Hayes smirked, as if reading their doubts. "Boone's not invincible. He's got a weakness. You just don't know where to look." Before Elijah could press him, Hayes leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Meet me tomorrow, out past Devil's Gulch. I'll show you." Then, as quickly as he had arrived, he melted back into the shadows, leaving only questions, and the gnawing sense that the devil himself had just ridden into camp. The next morning, Elijah and a handful of settlers followed Hayes into Devil's Gulch, a canyon carved by time and storms. The cliffs loomed high, their jagged shadows swallowing the men as they rode deeper. Hayes spoke little, his eyes scanning the ridges above as if expecting an ambush at any moment. Finally, he drew rein near a cluster of rocks. "Boone hides his loot here," Hayes said. "Gold, supplies, weapons. Take it, and you cut him off at the knees." The settler's eyes widened, but Elijah narrowed his gaze. "And why tell us this?" Hayes' grin was sharp as a knife. "Because Boone left me for dead once. I've been waiting years to return the favor." Before Elijah could reply, a shot rang out. Dust exploded from the rocks as bullets rained down from above. Boone's men had been waiting all along. Devil's Gulch wasn't a promise of fortune. It was a trap. Gunfire echoed through the canyon as Boone's men poured lead from the cliffs. Settlers scrambled for cover, pinned down by the deadly rain of bullets. Elijah returned fire, the roar of his revolver lost in the chaos. Hayes fought like a man possessed, his rifle cracking again and again, his eyes blazing with vengeance. But the outlaws had the high ground, and every second in the gulch meant certain death. "We've got to smoke him out," Hayes shouted. Without hesitation, he grabbed a stick of dynamite from his saddlebag, lit the fuse, and hurled it toward the cliffs. The explosion shook the earth, sending boulders crashing down in a storm of rock and flame. Outlaws screamed as the canyon collapsed, dust and fire filling the air. Elijah coughed, dragging Mary to safety as the world thundered around them. When the dust settled, silence returned. Boone's men were scattered, broken, but Boone himself was nowhere to be found. Elijah realized with a sinking heart that the outlaw had once again slipped through their grasp. And if Hayes was right, Boone was only getting stronger. The canyon still smoldered from the dynamite blast, smoke curling into the morning sky like the breath of some ancient beast. The settlers limped out, battered and bruised, their clothes torn, their spirits shaken. Hayes led them back toward camp, his silence heavy, his face grim. Mary tended the wounded with steady hands, though her own were blistered and bleeding. Elijah sat apart, staring at the horizon. He couldn't shake the thought that Boone had known their every move, that somehow, someone in Dusty Creek was feeding him information. That night, while the settlers slept, Elijah walked the camp's perimeter. He stopped short when he saw it, another boot print, fresh in the dust, circling close to the wagons. His gut clenched. Boone's men weren't just striking hard. They were watching, waiting, like wolves circling prey. Dusty Creek grew restless in Boone's shadow. With the sheriff gone, the town's merchants began paying Boone's men for protection, their silver coins buying false safety. The saloon brimmed with laughter and gun smoke, outlaws swaggering as though they owned the place. Elijah stormed through the swinging doors, his hand on his revolver. "This ends tonight," he growled. But the townsfolk avoided his eyes, turning away, afraid to stand with him. Only Mary and a handful of settlers stood at his back. Boone appeared from the far end of the bar, his black hat tipped low, his grin sharp as broken glass. "You've got spirit, Carter," he drawled. "But spirit don't win wars. Men do. And every man in this town knows I'm the one holding the cards." The room fell silent. Elijah's hand twitched near his holster. Boone's grin widened. "Draw," he whispered. Elijah froze, because he realized if he fired now, it wouldn't just be Boone he'd be fighting. It would be the whole town. That night, Hayes pulled Elijah aside beneath the glow of a lantern. His voice was low, urgent. "You don't understand Boone. He ain't just an outlaw, he's building something. A kingdom." Elijah frowned. "A kingdom?" Hayes nodded grimly. "Every cattle herd he steals, every wagon train he raids, it all feeds into a bigger plan. He's stockpiling food, guns, and gold. And he's recruiting outlaws, deserters, even men who once wore badges. Soon enough, Boone won't just control Dusty Creek. He'll control the entire frontier." Elijah's blood ran cold. Boone wasn't a man to be hunted down. He was a storm sweeping across the west. And unless someone stopped him, no settlement would be safe. Hayes placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "If you want to beat him, you can't just fight like a farmer. You've got to fight like an outlaw." The settlers moved camp under Hayes' guidance, hiding deep within the cottonwoods along the riverbank. They set watches, sharpened blades, and prayed Boone's men wouldn't find them. But the night was too still, the silence too deep. Elijah's nerves prickled. Then came the whistling cry of a hawk, the signal Boone's men used. Shadows erupted from the trees, gunfire flashing in the dark. The settlers scrambled, firing blindly as chaos tore through the camp. Horses screamed, wagons burned, and bullets ripped the night apart. Mary clutched the children, firing her hidden revolver into the blackness. Hayes fought like a demon, cutting down one outlaw after another. But the settlers were outnumbered. Boone himself never appeared, only his riders, ruthless and merciless. By dawn, the riverbank was littered with ash and blood. Elijah staggered through the wreckage, his ears ringing, his heart heavy. They had survived, but barely. And Boone's shadow loomed larger than ever. Elijah sat by the dying fire, his hands trembling. Hayes approached, his expression unreadable. "We can't keep running," Hayes said. "If we want to beat Boone, we've got to strike first. Hit him where it hurts." Elijah looked up, weary but determined. "Where?" Hayes' eyes glinted. "He's got a fortress. An old Spanish mission out in the desert. That's where he keeps his gold, his weapons, his men. Break that, and you break him." Mary listened, her face pale. "And if it's a trap?" Hayes smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried too much pain. "Then we die trying." The wind howled across the camp, carrying with it the sound of coyotes in the distance. Elijah felt the weight of his choice pressing down. If they rode into that mission, there would be no turning back. Boone wanted war. And now, Elijah was ready to give it to him. The desert stretched out before them, endless and cruel, the sun beating down like a hammer. For days, Elijah, Mary, Hayes, and the surviving settlers rode toward the mission Hayes had spoken of. Their water ran low, their lips cracked, their horses stumbling with exhaustion. Finally, the ruins rose from the horizon, a crumbling Spanish mission, its white stone walls weathered by time, now flying Boone's black flag. Campfires burned inside the courtyard, the silhouettes of armed men moving along the ramparts. Boone's fortress stood like a scar against the land. Hayes crouched low, pointing toward a half-collapsed wall. "That's our way in," he whispered. Elijah stared at the fortress, his jaw set. This wasn't just another raid. This was the heart of Boone's empire. And if they struck here, they'd either break his grip, or be buried in the sand forever. Under the cover of night, Elijah and Hayes led a small band through the broken wall. The air smelled of sweat, whiskey, and gunpowder. Boone's men laughed around campfires, their rifles stacked nearby, their guards lowered. The settlers crept through the shadows, knives in hand. They slit throats, seized weapons, and pressed deeper into the mission. Elijah's heart pounded as he passed rooms filled with crates of ammunition, barrels of whiskey, and stacks of stolen gold. Boone had built an empire of blood. But then Elijah froze. Through a cracked door, he saw something that turned his stomach. Prisoners. Settlers from other wagon trains, chained and beaten, their eyes hollow. Boone wasn't just robbing wagons. He was enslaving survivors. Elijah's blood boiled with rage. But before he could act, a mocking voice rang out across the courtyard. "Well, well," Boone drawled, stepping into the firelight, flanked by dozens of armed men. "The farmer found his way to my table." The outlaws closed in, rifles gleaming in the firelight. Elijah's settlers were outnumbered 5-1, their weapons raised but their hands shaking. Boone stepped forward, his black coat swirling like smoke, his smile wide and cold. "You've got grit, Carter," Boone said. "I'll give you that. But grit doesn't feed families. It doesn't win wars. You want to save your people? Bend the knee. Join me. I'll make you my right hand. Together, we'll own this frontier." Elijah's heart thundered. Boone was offering power, safety, survival, but at the cost of everything he believed in. The settlers looked to him with wide eyes, their hope hanging by a thread. Mary's gaze cut through the firelight, fierce and unyielding. "Don't," she whispered. "Not him. Not ever." Elijah's hand tightened on his revolver. Boone's grin faltered, his eyes narrowing. The silence stretched, the night waiting to break. Elijah fired first. The bullet tore through Boone's hat, missing his skull by an inch. The courtyard exploded in chaos, settlers and outlaws colliding in a storm of bullets and blood. Prisoners broke their chains and joined the fight, desperation fueling their rage. Hayes fought like a man possessed, cutting a path through Boone's men. Mary fired her revolver until the barrel smoked, each shot buying them seconds. Elijah grabbed a torch and hurled it into the ammunition room. Flames roared to life, the mission shaking as gunpowder began to cook. "Move!" Elijah shouted, dragging survivors through the collapsing wall. The explosion ripped the night apart, fire lighting the desert sky. The mission burned, Boone's treasure with it. But as the settlers staggered into the open desert, coughing and bleeding, Elijah knew it wasn't over. Boone wasn't dead. Somewhere in the smoke and fire, he had slipped away again. And next time, Boone wouldn't underestimate him. The survivors made camp in the desert, their bodies battered, their souls weary. They had struck a blow against Boone, but at a terrible cost. Many had fallen in the mission, their names now etched in silence. Elijah sat apart, staring into the flames. Hayes approached, a bloody bandage wrapped around his arm. "You made the right choice," he said. "Boone wanted you on a leash. Instead, you cut him deep. But you should know, he won't forgive this. He'll raise hell like you've never seen." Mary joined them, her face pale but her eyes fierce. "Then let him," she said. "We didn't come west to kneel. We came to build. And I'll die standing before I ever bow." The wind howled across the desert, carrying with it the faint echo of hooves. Boone was still out there, gathering his forces, plotting vengeance. Elijah clenched his fists. The next battle would decide not just Dusty Creek, but the fate of the entire frontier. The weeks after the mission's destruction were filled with uneasy quiet. Dusty Creek lay under a heavy sky, its people tense, waiting for the storm they knew was coming. And it came, like thunder on the horizon. Boone returned, not with a gang, but with an army. Deserters, mercenaries, killers for hire, men bound not by loyalty, but by greed. His riders swept across the plains, torching homesteads, scattering herds, leaving survivors with only one message: "Tell Carter I'm coming." Dusty Creek streets filled with smoke as Boone's men marched openly through town, daring anyone to resist. The saloon became his headquarters, the black flag raised over Main Street. From a ridge above, Elijah watched the town he had bled for swallowed whole. Mary gripped his arm, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "If we wait any longer, there'll be nothing left to fight for." Elijah's jaw tightened. Boone hadn't just declared war, he had brought it to their very doorstep. Elijah sent word across the plains, calling on every settler, rancher, and drifter who had ever suffered under Boone's reign. They came in twos and threes, rough men with scarred hands, women with fire in their eyes, children clutching rifles too big for their shoulders. It wasn't an army, it was a people, desperate and determined. In the dusty clearing outside town, Elijah stood before them. "Boone thinks he owns the West," he said, his voice carrying like a church bell. "But the West ain't his, it's ours. And tonight, we take it back." Hayes rode up beside him, a cigar clenched between his teeth. "Boone's got the numbers. He's got the guns. But we've got something he'll never have, cause." He spat into the dust, his eyes gleaming. "And a cause is harder to kill than any man." The settlers cheered, but as night fell, Elijah knew the truth. Many of them would not live to see dawn. The battle began at dawn. Settlers poured into Dusty Creek, rifles cracking, arrows whistling, dynamite roaring. Boone's men answered with cannons salvaged from the war, their thunder shaking the ground. Main Street became a river of gun smoke and blood, the church bell tolling again and again as though counting the dead. Mary fought from the rooftops, her revolver blazing, her dress torn and streaked with soot. Hayes led charges through the alleys, his rifle spitting fire, his curses ringing louder than the gunfire. Elijah moved like a man possessed, cutting down Boone's lieutenants one by one, each shot fueled by years of pain and loss. By midday, half the town was in ruins. Flames licked at the saloon where Boone had taken his stand, his black flag still whipping defiantly in the wind. And then, through the smoke, Boone himself emerged, hat low, pistols gleaming, eyes locked on Elijah. The showdown the West had waited for was about to begin. The street emptied, silence falling like a shroud. Dust swirled in the heat, the crackle of flames the only sound. Boone stood at one end, Elijah at the other. Every soul left alive held their breath. "Should have taken my offer," Boone sneered, his voice cutting through the stillness. "You could have been a king." "I didn't come west to be a king," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "I came to be free." Time slowed. Boone's hand twitched. Elijah drew. 2 shots split the air. One bullet struck Boone's chest, spinning him back in a spray of blood. His pistol fired wide, the shot shattering a window behind Elijah. Boone staggered, his knees buckling, his black hat tumbling into the dust. He fell to his knees, gasping, his grin still twisted across his bloodied face. "You think this ends with me?" he rasped. "The West don't bow to men like you." Then his body went still, his empire collapsing with him. Dusty Creek smoldered, half its buildings gone, its streets littered with the scars of battle. The survivors gathered in the square, their faces hollow with grief, yet burning with something new, hope. Boone was dead. His shadow had lifted. Elijah stood before them, Mary at his side, Hayes limping but alive. "We've bled, we've buried, we've nearly broken," Elijah said, his voice raw. "But this land, this frontier, it's ours now. And what we build here will outlive every outlaw, every tyrant, every boon the West throws at us." The people cheered, their voices rising into the smoke-streaked sky. Children clung to their mothers, settlers clasped hands, and for the first time in years, Dusty Creek felt free. As the sun rose over the desert, painting the sky gold, Elijah lifted his face to the light. The West was still wild, still dangerous, still untamed, but it no longer belonged to Boone. It belonged to those who dared to fight, to love, to hope. It belonged to pioneers. The frontier was not just a place. It was a spirit, and that spirit would never die.